Okay, welcome to session 3. My name is Jim Snow. I'll be the moderator for this session. Just a couple of quick reminders before I turn it over to our speakers. One, please, speakers, please be mindful of the 15-minute time limit. We have a busy schedule today. And also, as Tim mentioned just a few moments ago, we can't respond to raised hands, but we do encourage you to put questions in the Q&A box, which is linked at the bottom of the screen. And also, I want to encourage you to put comments there as well, so questions and comments. So with that said, this is going to be an exciting session, I think. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the floor. Basically, I'm not going to develop a lot of concepts or definition. I'll just have to talk about the work of Educators Institute for Human Rights here in the Democratic Republic of Congo, what we try to achieve in the field of Holocaust, genocide, and mass atrocity prevention. So the Educators Institute for Human Rights created with the teachers in DRC an educator guide to Holocaust and mass atrocity and building peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This was to fill a gap in the education sector about the subject. In reality, the education here has not set up mass atrocity or genocide curriculum within the education sector. Nonetheless, we still experience a lot of killings and mass atrocity. And what we try to do is to help the teacher to be able to teach to help the student to be aware of that and how they can be able to contribute to peace and non-violence environment in the country. First, the question of genocide remains very sensitive in the country because when you talk about it, people just remind the serious atrocity that the country has experienced for over 30 years. Now, is not talking about genocide or mass killing the solution? No, we need to talk about it. Recently, under the pressure from civic movement, the date of August has been dedicated as a day of a commemoration for genocide for economic gain, as known as Holocaust. So the guide that we have developed try to provide the teachers some tools, as this is a personalized, a kind of contextualized teacher guide. So we try to personalize it so that the learning experience in relationship to the learner's identity, home, or community can be perceived differently. So the guide tried to help teachers, but also students to develop a kind of critical thinking in their skill to build a culture of peace and non-violence. So this guideline provide teacher with the tools, not only the tools, but also method to address issues of genocide, atrocity, and other crime against humanity. The guide itself try to provide the guidelines, but also explanation on how the teacher should approach a subject and which methodology should be used to push for a critical thinking and positive attitude. For example, one of the guidelines is avoiding simple answers to complex questions. These are type of guidelines that have been developed by the U.S. Holocaust Museum, but also other organizations with a good reputation in the field. The guide can be found on Educators Institute for Human Rights website under publication. So we are also talking advantage of the technology. I know yesterday some of the previous presenter showed the importance of the artificial intelligence in the field of teaching peace education. We have developed a peace education short message application with a chat box, which can help teachers or anybody with internet access to be able to access some of the available resources in the field of genocide and other atrocity prevention. Besides that, AAHR organized online workshop. So I was saying that we are also, because some of the presenters yesterday mentioned the use of artificial intelligence. We are taking advantage of technology with the Peace Education Short Message app with a chat box, which can enable teachers, but also anyone with internet access to be able to access some of the resources in the field of atrocity prevention. Besides that, on a yearly basis, AHR also organize some online workshop, which can help the teachers who are in the remote area to be able to connect and follow such kind of education or kind of capacity building opportunity. So the intention is we continue to expand this to cover the whole country, but continue organizing a workshop to build the capacity of many teachers to be able to help them in this field of peace education. So crime against humanity in the DRC has been mostly known for the armed conflict that has killed thousands or millions of people within the three decades following the exploitation of minerals. However, the interethnic conflict, the tribalism, regionalism, and other facets have also caused many consequences in the country. And this is not starting today. It has been there since the independence since the beginning of independence years like 1996. You can see that in the Kivus, there had already been problem with indigenous and immigrant or transplants. And it has resulted from murders, village ban, and so forth, including extrajudicially execution. You have also other conflict in Ituri between the Hema and the Lendu that continue to claim victims, but also you have conflict just in the Maindombe territory, which is next to the capital city of Kinshasa. The conflict between the Mbole and the Lengole in the province of Chopo has killed this year 740 people from the two communities, but also resulted with displacement of 75,000 of people living into the difficult condition in the displacement camp. So all this shows the magnitude and the complexity that a teacher in a classroom could face when he must teach a child who's from the family or who the parent has already learned to him that the person from the other group is the enemy. So imagine a situation where a parent has been beheaded by a member of another student. So I was saying, sorry for the background. I was saying a student whose parent has been beheaded by a member of another student and group, and they are attending the same school or the same class, or a village where they have been banned and there have been kind of plan for revenge. Or maybe a family who has fled from their house, their home, to an internationally displacement camp without food and living. Or a teacher who is also living in a rhetoric where you have hate or hate speech across the country or community. Besides that, you'll see also some of the government appointments also are based on ethnic. All this situation make it very complicated. The biggest question we grapple with the DRC is how can an educator make school more equitable, more supportive, more protective, and everyone's right while teaching a complex history of human rights violation and the genocide to improve the future of DRC. So these are the type of things we try to address with our work here in DRC, and we hope that we'll be able to contribute. So because I'll have to go, I don't know if with the remaining 4 minutes, someone has a question to ask, I'm happy to answer. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jamie Wise.
But just want to start out by saying thank you so much to everyone for being here, for your commitment to genocide education, and for the organizers for really convening a really rewarding opportunity for all of us to share insights. So my name is Jamie Wise. I'm from the Zeckelman Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills, Michigan. My role there is to conduct educational programming, museum tours for students, teachers, and adult learners. But before I entered that role, I actually did my master's degree at George Mason University, focusing on genocide prevention in a number of different case studies. And when I first stepped into a role in museum education, I found myself very curious about how to bridge some of this gap between the public education field and the academic realms of genocide studies and peace studies to be able to share some of these incredible insights that the research has given us over the last few decades and really translate them for ways that make it easier for the public that has an interest in learning about these topics to engage, and also for educators to have these kinds of conversations with their students, whether they're just interested in teaching about it or if it's mandated. So out of that sort of curiosity came this project that I'm really excited to introduce to you today, the creation of the Genocide and the Peace Models that you see right here on screen. We developed these as tools for use in education to teach both about genocide and its prevention through the lens of peace building. The way we designed these was sort of drafting them through a review of the literature, and then really speaking to a lot of genocide scholars, Holocaust educators, classroom teachers who teach about many different genocides. We even prototyped these models and put them on the walls of our museum and then surveyed visitors walking through to get their feedback on it. And what you're seeing today here is that final product of what we were able to design to communicate what we think are really some essential insights about how genocide happens, and then alternatively, how we can build a more peaceful world. So my hope by the end of this very brief presentation is that you'll feel inspired and empowered to use these in your own classroom or conversation in whatever settings you're in to educate. So with that, I want to go ahead and start by introducing the genocide model. Of course, genocide scholars have acknowledged for quite a long time that genocide is a process and not a singular event. At the same time, there's really no universally agreed upon model to illustrate how genocide unfolds. Of course, many educators use Dr. Stanton's 10 stages of genocide model. Other educators I've talked to have used the Anti-Defamation League's Pyramid of Hate. These are really wonderful tools to use in your classroom, depending on the age of your learners, the type of educational goals you're going for. And we really hope that the genocide model becomes another tool in your toolkit as educators to teach about this topic. And the way we framed the genocide model was really to take a sociological approach to thinking about how genocide happens and to move away from some of these time-based, more sequenced models to really focus on people, to focus on relationships, and to focus on choices, both at the individual and collective level. So if you're already starting to take a look at this model, you've probably noticed that there's this sort of central divide between individual and collective choices. This is really one of the big main ideas we try to communicate throughout this model. But let me first point you to the definition at the top. So we placed genocide here with sort of a paraphrased version of the convention's definition emphasizing the intent to destroy a particular group of people as the essence of genocide, and positioned it at the very top of the model to indicate that everything else that's inside the boundaries of this triangle, and even without, are intended to illustrate different manifestations of genocide, either the lead up to it or sort of the active commission of these crimes. So it's meant to paint this picture, to show the different facets of genocide, more than just mass killing, to really illustrate how the different attitudes and actions held by individuals, and in addition to that, the types of policies and the organization of violence and some of these violent social structures that are developed during genocide become the mechanisms in which this violence takes place, to really create this broader view. The idea between making this divide between individual and collective choices shows us these different shades of responsibility, right? It shows us that individuals are responsible for their own actions and behaviors, but that they're not sort of isolated, that every choice that an individual makes is connected back to the broader society and community in which they're living. So we have to be able to look at both sides of this coin, right? How individuals make these choices that shape the people around them, but also how collective policies that can often be sort of spurred on or implemented, designed even by leaders in social and political roles, can then shape society and really turn genocidal ideation into plans, into action. The way we designed this was to deliberately place these side by side and to make the sort of four key elements that you see here all sort of located in parallel, because these aren't steps, these aren't stages. These are often things that are sort of co-produced and occurring concurrently in these societies that are moving towards escalating dynamics of violence. So we really want to be able to start that conversation about some of the complex relationships that cross that divide between individual and collective choices, to really hone in on that aspect of responsibility and how people's choices, both on their own and within the sort of society that they're in, has power to shape these types of incidents. The last thing you'll notice about the model is we have context written in at the bottom. And this is where we've placed many of the risk factors that have been identified over decades of genocide studies research that make genocide much more likely. These are these vulnerabilities on which, political elites who are interested in pursuing a genocidal agenda can manipulate, but they're also indicators of this broader environment in which individuals are making choices about how to live out their day-to-day lives and interactions with their neighbors. And so this really helps to make that really critical point that no genocide arises out of vacuum. It's always preceded by certain conditions that shape how people perceive genocidal ideologies and how it unfolds in their particular time, place, and context. So it's important to see how that undergirds all the rest of these choices, both at the individual and collective level. The bulleted lists you see on the side are just a non-exhaustive list of examples to, again, help illustrate some of these warning signs, some of these risk factors. And what I've pointed out on the left side of the screen here are just some of the topics in the literature in genocide studies that really we were taking into consideration as we built out pieces of this model to try to, again, integrate the sort of state of the field into something that could be accessible and digestible to many different audiences. So then when we take a look at the peace model, you'll notice that it's designed exactly like the genocide model, but every aspect of it is inverted. Almost all the words that you see here are the sort of opposite of the words in the genocide model, to kind of reversing the meaning. And the goal here was to try to paint a picture of a society at peace in which genocide is extremely unlikely. So taking an approach to prevention that is framed not in the negative in terms of responding to perpetrators or trying to mitigate perpetrator capacity, et cetera, although all that's important, the approach we're taking here is to really engage people on an individual level, to engage them as community members, to engage them as citizens, to engage them as people who care deeply about their neighbors, their workplace, the people that they're around every day. And this becomes a model for empowerment. So again, you see this dichotomy between individual and collective choices, but the words you're now seeing are compassion, caring, altruism, charity, things that people can latch onto when they think about the microdynamics of what stitching together a peaceful reality actually looks like from the ground up. And then, of course, we draw from a lot of literature in the field of peace building and reconciliation and transitional justice to highlight some of the structural elements that are so important to sustaining peace in the world today. These include policies that protect individual rights and civil liberties, enshrine human rights, ensure that the rule of law is protected, and that there are peaceful mechanisms of conflict resolution within society. So this creates a whole different vision, kind of the opposite paradigm as what the genocide model shows. And of course, context appears here as well, because it's easier for everything above that line, all these types of choices, to flourish when the environment is one in which people are encouraged to act out these behaviors, are encouraged to sort of act in these pro-social ways and contribute to building that positive vision of a society. So what we really love about these models is that they become really, really practical. And I put a quote on the screen here from just one Michigan educator who had the chance to take one of our trainings on using these models. And they said that they found it so important because when they teach about the Holocaust, sometimes they found that their students just felt defeated afterward, and they didn't really know where to take the conversation after that. But by seeing the peace model, being able to pair it with the study of genocide that they were engaging in their classroom, they were able to paint this positive vision for their students, the real impact that they could have in their neighborhoods. And that's the exact goal, right? Because I think most of us don't enter this field of teaching about genocide just because we want to teach people how to commit a genocide by showing all the different steps and component parts. That's definitely not the idea. The idea is to prevent it, is to protect, is to augment resilience within our own communities and to see the role we can play. So the peace model really creates the grounds for that. And you'll also see here a photo on screen. This is what the models look like on display in our museum at the Zuckelman Holocaust Center. They're kind of these life-sized models, and they're located in a sort of reflection space that concludes the exhibit of sort of the chronology of events of the Holocaust. So this becomes a place where people can think really deeply about that one particular case study, apply it to the different elements they see in the genocide model, but then also have the peace model there as that way to sort of take away some insights as they leave the building and go back into their everyday lives. And you'll notice that the visitor here is taking a picture of the models. And that's just really a wonderful indicator of success, of how these models are engaging, they're vivid, they're interesting to look at, they spur on curiosity. People take away photos like that and they have different conversations with people in their lives about what they've seen, about the meaning of that experience. And that's truly kind of one of the ideal outcomes of being able to engage with some of this history. So I hope that seeing these, you'll feel empowered to implement them in your classrooms, in your museum, wherever you are educating, and take it with you. I'll throw my contact information on the screen here. I'm about to publish a teacher's guide for how to utilize the pyramids. So if you're interested in learning more about that, please shoot me an email. I'm happy to give it to you. The only thing I would ask is that if you implement this in your classroom, let me know how it goes. We are so open to getting feedback, to hearing insights, what questions your students have about these, what they're learning, what you're pairing it with, what types of activities you design around it. We really want to sort of hear back from you and keep those feedback loops open, so that as we continue as a community, as a genocide education community, to learn how to create these inroads between academia and education, that stays strong and that we're all moving forward together. So thank you so much, and I'm really excited to hear your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. We'll move on to our last panel presenters.
Okay, thank you, James. I'm George Dalbo.
I'm Irene Ann Resenley.
And we're going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing with guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust and genocide. Okay, before we talk about guidelines, we want to just kind of contextualize a little bit of what we're going to say with a few points about Holocaust and genocide education in the United States. And so over the last decade, many states have introduced mandates, Holocaust and genocide education mandates. And these mandates often don't address what or how to teach. Most of them, and this was mentioned yesterday, aren't funded. And of course, when they're not funded, there's very few resources, let alone curricula, that are developed to support teachers in meeting these mandates.
Often in the United States, when we hear about genocides being taught, particularly the Holocaust in pop culture spaces, so like the media, there's a lot of fear-based rhetoric around it. Meaning what we hear most often about genocide education in schools is students don't know this. they are only learning about it for one day here, or we hear sensationalist stories of troublesome things that might be happening in classrooms. Very rarely do we hear about sort of meaningful learning experiences or the work of teachers sort of writ large in the US.
So also institutions have created, starting about 30 years ago, and we'll talk more about this in just a moment, guidelines for teaching about the Holocaust, and less so about genocide, but increasingly guidelines for teaching about genocide. And these guidelines offer very little support, in our view, for teachers that engage in this work.
And that support is becoming more and more critical as we see the teaching of genocide creeping into younger and younger grades. So for example, in the state of Wisconsin, with our mandate to teach about the Holocaust and a genocide that is not the Holocaust, part of the requirement is that they are taught in middle school. We also see with the teaching of the Holocaust through literature in particular, that you could see genocide being taught as young as 4th grade. So what does that mean for how we could support teachers in this important work?
And then just lastly about other genocides. Despite receiving more attention in recent years, other genocides other than the Holocaust are still underrepresented in US classrooms and curricula. And so the guidelines that are probably most familiar with folks that were already mentioned in this panel once are those created by USHMM, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. These were created in 1993 and have shifted slightly in their wording. You see the abbreviated version on the screen now. Some of the things that we would point out with these guidelines is that they center often content and not teaching or learning, and don't center teachers or learners. They often, in that way, present the what, but not the how or the who in teaching about the Holocaust and genocide. They often center Jewish experiences in the Holocaust and not other groups that were victimized by the Nazis. They center victims' experiences and don't look at other groups that are active in genocide. They're overly cautious of connections, comparisons to other instances of genocide or mass violence. And I think most of all for us, they're dated. They were written in the 1990s and have changed little. And if we think about how much Holocaust studies, genocide studies have changed as fields, or education as a field has changed in the last 30 years, we think that these guidelines are due for an update.
And so with that, for George and I, each who have 20 years of experience in this field across different kind of educational spaces, we wanted to offer a new approach to guidelines. And here's a little bit more of our why behind that. So we hope that our approach to guidelines, you'll see in a moment what they look like. They are rooted in questions for educators and really meant to be used as a tool for reflection and to engender kind of critical thought around the practice of genocide education. We hope that these guidelines, our intention is that they empower teachers and put trust in teachers with tools to guide their practice, as opposed to a set of statements saying what they must do. What we hope they offer as well is that these guidelines are connection seeking. And what we mean by that is the guidelines as a tool seek to offer connections across histories, across genocides, and also across students, families, communities, teachers, and students. And most importantly for us, we hope that they placed the trust and agency in educators and students' capacity to teach and learn about the Holocaust and genocide in ways that are both accessible and meaningful for them. So here is kind of the first third of our guidelines. Here's what they look like. So you'll see there's kind of a statement in bold here that like serves as sort of the topic for the questions we want to ask, and then a series of reflective questions afterwards. So you might see right off the bat, our first guideline, recognize our teacher capacity, teach from a place where we could bring confidence as a facilitator of these histories. We've looked at a lot of different guidelines over our times as educators and scholars, and we haven't been able to identify one that really centers the teacher right away, their capacities, their tools, and their strengths, and where they hope to grow. And placing that first, we hope that kind of sets the tone for these here.
So the second guideline is center communities, and we think this is also incredibly important. Center communities create space to bring in our students' needs, curiosities, lived experiences, and community cultural wealth. And I'll just share, I think for me, a personal connection to this second reflective question. I was teaching in a school where 80 to 90% of the students in this large urban high school were Hmong. So the Hmong are an ethnic group, displaced indigenous group from Southeast Asia, and came to the United States largely in the 1990s. And many of my students, when we would learn about the Holocaust in a ninth grade world history course, would ask, why aren't we talking about the Hmong genocide, the genocide that the Hmong people experienced? And of course, as a new teacher, I turned to scholars. I turned to the field of genocide studies and was met with, the Hmong did not experience genocide. And I often shut down those experiences or those conversations in my classroom. And I wonder what it would mean to make those connections for students, to center their families' experiences rather than deny them. And the third one here, embrace productive parallels. Productive parallels are those that seek to deepen our understanding of multiple histories by placing them in conversation with each other.
Our next guideline, address complexity. Consider context, positionality, and actions when addressing how individuals and groups navigate particular histories. Here we have some questions around kind of how can we move beyond sort of typical identities in our field of victim-perpetrator binaries, bystander-upstander ones, and questions around fostering empathy. Our fifth one, balance understanding of systems and stories. Individual stories foster empathy and connection. Understanding systems and context helps create knowledge around historical patterns and answer the why and the how. Both are necessary at every grade level. And for me, that helps us come into our sixth guideline as well. Consider age accessibility. Teach in a way that is accessible and meaningful for the age group we are teaching. So in addition to being a scholar, I'm also an active middle school teacher. I've taught the Holocaust in high school grades as well, but in 4th grade, 5th grade, and 8th grade. I've taught about the genocide in Rwanda in 8th grade. And this question of age accessibility is really central in my practice when we're talking about what does it mean to teach about genocide in a way that our students are able to understand without being overwhelmed. And for me, that idea of age accessibility in my practice comes in the form of language accessibility, right? How are we picking sources where the vocabulary is accessible for our students to take in the ideas? And how are we thinking of age accessibility in the context of the extent to which we are talking about violence and trauma? That will necessarily look very different in 4th grade than it will in 5th grade, than it will in 8th grade. And I, as a teacher, am constantly using questions like this to help reflect on where are those lines. But I think in connecting it back to number 5 for me, what is age accessible in this across all grades, I would argue, is that balance of individual and systems. Our next guideline is anchor in learning objectives and context. When teaching about the Holocaust and genocide, do not feel like we need to teach it all. If I could scream anything from the rooftops to my fellow classroom teachers, it would be that based on our time constraints, based on the context in which we are teaching it, to be really understanding, and those learning objectives, those goals are our anchors, and that is meaningful and that is fine.
Guideline number 8 is recognize the difficult, acknowledge that learning about genocide and mass violence can be emotionally difficult for both teachers and students.
And our last guideline, engage with critical approaches, interrogate power relationships among individuals, groups, and nations, and within the study of Holocaust and genocide studies in schools, right? So even having students of all ages reflect on, why do we talk about some instances of genocides and not the other? How can we put them in conversation with each other? And how are historically underrepresented groups positioned even in the study of this in general? So as we show you, as we presented these with a broad overview here, the last thing we'll kind of leave you with is these guidelines are meant to be used in whole or in part, whether each of those altogether can offer a meaningful overview for an educator when considering their practice, or if they're using it, say, for goal setting, to think about kind of one aspect of their teaching of genocide here, and use the questions as a point of reflections. But we also hope in the conversation we could hear from some of you all about how could this tool be applied in your educational context.
And so we recognize this was way too much, way too fast, and we will shortly put an email address into the chat. And so if you'd like to connect with us and receive a copy of an emailed copy of the guidelines, we're happy to do that and connect further.
Thank you. Yeah, have you placed the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum guidelines within the international discussion of the IHRA recommendations?
Yes, it's a great question. I'm assuming that's for us. It's a great question. We have considered the international guidelines, and they actually, I think, in my view, do a better job than USHMM's guidelines, which shouldn't maybe be surprising. They were written much later, right? And so I think we're focused mostly on the United States and looking at the guidelines, the USHMM guidelines that are so widely taken up in the United States. And there are other international guidelines that exist out there, but it's rare that they're taken up in the United States. And so much, even regional institutions that might write their own guidelines rely on USHMM's guidelines as almost a template or a guide for creating their own guidelines, at least in the ones that we've surveyed.
Okay, thank you. George, I have a question for you. And my apologies that you got stuck with me as your moderator 2 days in a row. But I want to go back to your recommendation number 8, recognizing, and I'm using your word here, recognizing the emotional dimension that this can be difficult. I've taught at a Jesuit university for many, many years, and central to Jesuit pedagogy is tapping into the affective, emotional dimension of learning, which tends to not be a major part of college or even high school or middle school education. So a few years ago in my genocide courses at the university level, I really asked students to tune in to how to the affective dimension of their learning, and especially when we would look at documentaries and witness and survivor testimony and so forth. So I would want to argue that we need to do more than recognize, but we need to really embrace that affective dimension of our learning. Could you say a little bit more about that guideline?
I'll jump in and start. I think in that guideline, it's also important to emphasize that we're recognizing, acknowledging, surfacing the difficult for the teacher in teaching this as well, right? Like, especially when we think about our secondary educators who might teach a lesson multiple times in a day, that's extraordinarily emotionally provocative, maybe for a teacher emotionally draining, that we need to maybe you're right, recognize is not enough, maybe recognize is the first step, but think about like what that means for both the educators and the students in that space, that this could be emotionally difficult work.
Yeah, I'll echo that too. And thanks for the feedback. I mean, that's exactly why we love to, it's rather recent that we've been talking about this. And so any feedback is so welcome. Yeah. And that'll give us quite a bit to mull over.
Okay, well, another question just popped up for the two of you in the Q&A box. do you have examples of how you or others at the middle school, high school level use your guidelines to redesign a course or unit on genocide?
Oh, not yet, but I hope the answer could be yes to that shortly. No, but we've shared these with a group of veteran educators, and we've shared these with a group of pre-service teachers as well. And I can tell you what I noticed and how they looked at them as a tool was the pre-service teachers were looking at them, right, sort of more holistically, and saying like, okay, so this is the starting point for my thinking. And I sort of noticed that the veteran teachers sort of would hone in on one in particular and think about it as a like reflection conversation or goal setting one. But how it's changed curriculum, to be determined. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I'll just echo what Irene, I think, mentioned during the presentation, that these really do grow out of our own classroom practice. And so I think these are all things that when we started teaching, maybe we're looking at things like the USHMM guidelines and, slowly over the years have, pushed back on those in ways as we've developed our own curricula and developed our own practice. And so, yeah.
Okay, there's another question that just came in from Maureen. What types of conversations are you having currently with educators regarding potential mass atrocity in the U.S., given the current state of things, / politics? This is also for Jamie.
Yeah, I can start on this one. I think that's a great question. I think it's something that's on a lot of people's minds. And I think that's where the genocide model and especially the peace model have become really, really important tools for people, because a lot of the ways that genocide prevention is typically framed is through a foreign policy lens, is through thinking about things like armed intervention, or sort of different foreign policy tools to coerce or compel or entice leaders in other countries and other places perpetrating this violence that sort of can dominate the narrative of what genocide prevention is. So the peace model sort of really backs away from that and says, actually, prevention starts in your own community and it starts with you. And it's more about thinking about a holistic approach to how people's everyday interactions are really important for producing then what is like experienced on the whole, and how it's not just about how people live there every day, but it's also about making sure that you're safeguarding these structures that exist within society that we know promote reconciliation, promote peaceful conflict resolution and such in society. And so I think why a lot of people have gravitated towards this model in particular is because it actually invites them to think about their own country. It actually invites them to think about their own backyard and what they can do. Whereas when the conversation is so dominated by exclusively foreign policy tools, it's really easy for people to be like, well, I don't work in the State Department, so that really means nothing to me. Even if that is, of course, a really important aspect of this work. I'm not trying to undermine that at all. But if we're really having serious conversations about genocide prevention writ large, this is something that really does apply to everybody. And so it's been cool to see how that conversation has shifted. So thank you for the question.
Thank you for the answer. Irene and George, do you want to take a stab at it as well?
Yeah, my answer won't be as succinct and thoughtful, maybe, but I'm thinking just lean into those conversations is what I always say to educators. I think it's such a shame when genocide education or Holocaust education, because of the parameters of maybe the discipline or ideas that educators have about what should be done in classrooms, shut those conversations down. When students bring to a class, to a teacher, connections to what's happening in the United States today, or indeed around the world. And I've certainly seen this with teachers that I've worked with, where they shut those conversations down and say, we don't want to make those connections to the Holocaust for fear of what that might do to the narrative of the Holocaust. Or indeed perhaps the narrative of the current event. And I would just say, I think it's so important. I think our guidelines push teachers to think about, what are the needs And, what are the curiosities of the students? What are they bringing into this space rather than prescribing, you should do this, you should do that, but encouraging teachers to think about with their community of learners, and their families, what their needs and curiosities are.
Irene, I see you nodding in agreement. Do you have anything to add?
Yes. And I would say too, to remember that those connections, I would argue 95% of the time, like are coming from a genuine place of curiosity and grappling and seeking to understand from students, that's a really powerful and beautiful thing to lean into.
Okay, Jamie, another question just popped up for you. This is from Stacy. She says, I may have missed this, but did you address ways to help risk societies becoming more peaceful?
Yeah, so I think what's really was our intention behind the Peace and the Genocide model was to help people see risk and resilience on this spectrum, right? Both of the models are these ideal types. No society exhibits either one of them perfectly by the letter 100% in every single aspect of what people experience. And so the idea of then addressing risk is that by mapping out and visualizing, okay, what are the two extremes of this type of these outcomes? Where can you kind of assess where a particular country is, a particular community is at any given moment? Are you more towards the peace end? Are you more towards the genocide end? Can you actually comb through and assess what are some of the risk factors, some of the resilience factors that you're seeing in society, and use kind of the pyramids as this framework for identifying what those aspects are? And then that can become a really generative exercise for saying, okay, how can you play on the strengths to help enhance protection within a particular case? And how can you address weaknesses and risks in order to, again, just bolster up some of that support? And I think the way that we've tried to conceive it with this sort of sociological concept of looking at individual agency, but also collective structures, is to try to show that there's this really broad bandwidth of tools and actors involved in these systems whose job it is to help mitigate those risks and push towards peace. And so it's about providing that really broad framework, and then hopefully helping people to see, that at the end of the day, genocide's not inevitable. It's the sum of our choices. And this has been sort of a guiding principle of Holocaust pedagogy, genocide education pedagogy for a long time, to ensure that we talk about how this stuff isn't inevitable. And there's a reason to feel like learning about this and taking action actually can improve results. So these tools just kind of help bring in that conversation in a new way, so people feel not overwhelmed by the risks, but can actually see some different avenues and ways forward.
Okay, well, one of the advantages of being a moderator is I get to ask my own question. In your presentations and throughout today and yesterday, the idea of human rights comes up again and again. And now I'm speaking as an academic. There's been a lot of criticism in academic circles by jurists, by international lawyers, and so forth about the idea of human rights, and beginning to question whether or not it's been a failure. And others, and here I'm thinking of Michael Ignatieff, for example, who argued that it's sort of an elitist Western concept. So I'm wondering, and perhaps this is an unfair question, but moving forward, Jamie with genocide prevention, George and Irene with teaching about genocide, how much work can we expect from the language of human rights, do you think?
I mean, that's a tough question. I think a lot of the challenges and critiques that you outlined are really, really important to think about. I think from more the public education lens, with like designing the peace model and having incorporated in that collective aspect, the inclusive policies, the social collaboration, that's trying to help people develop language around human rights, civil liberties, XYZ, and see how those things are connected, because people don't immediately necessarily associate those things with this like broader outcome of genocide prevention or enshrining peace. And so the goal is even to just raise awareness about people seeing those interconnections. It's not necessarily to say that, you know, human rights guarantees in X, Y, or Z way are proven to prevent X. It's not quite as simplistic as that, or such a direct connection. It's just to help people see more kind of the entire universe that's mapped out and begin to equip themselves with the language and the awareness that as they encounter these debates in the news, in current events and such, they can feel more equipped from a place of knowledge and being able to formulate their own opinions and respond. So again, not necessarily a cure-all, but I think it's certainly a relevant part of the conversation.
Okay, thank you. George or Irene, any thoughts on human rights language?
Yeah, I think I teach a high school course that is titled Genocide and Human Rights, and the bulk of the course is focused on atrocities and genocide and mass atrocity. And we do touch on human rights, and I do use peace building as a framework as well within the course. I think I approach human rights the way I would approach genocide in the UN definition of genocide, and to talk about the critiques of human rights, both in theory and in practice over the last half century or more, and make students aware of those. I don't know how useful the language of human rights is for students in the United States, high school students, and I imagine middle school students as well. It really, a lot of the language around human rights has fallen out of education in the last few decades. And so I think it's frustrating, were I to try to approach, teaching about things through a framework of human rights, I don't know if that resonates with my students as much as I might like it to. And yeah.
Another question just came in for Jamie. And this, I hope, is an easier question. How do the genocide and peace models incorporate the latest research in genocide studies? And what are some key insights or findings from this research that are reflected in the models? Asking this question to understand the academic foundations and contemporary research that inform the models, providing a deeper context for their development and application. And I guess I lied. I said it was an easier question. It's not.
Yeah, if I had maybe 3 hours, I could explain all of the different connections, but I'll definitely forward the piece that I'm writing because it does provide some direct citations and sort of indicates where a lot of the evidence is. But I think to just give you a quick answer that gives an overview, in particular with the genocide model, a lot of research, especially in perpetrator studies, when it comes to understanding why it is and how it is that individuals engage in genocidal violence, has really emphasized that there's not one single pathway to committing genocide, that it's not just about having hateful or prejudicial attitudes that in an emotional way cause you to feel motivated to commit violence against another person. A lot of the literature has been really about understanding the contextual foundations and the situational pressures, be they intergroup pressures and sort of like killing group dynamics. There's been a lot of work about that, or sort of pressures that come down from social expectations devised by the state or the community that really impel people to commit this type of violence, even without necessarily holding in a strong way a prejudicial belief, as we might expect. Really just sort of opens our minds to all of the different factors that influence perpetration and perpetrator behavior. So the way we tried to be mindful of incorporating that within the genocide model was, again, arranging all of these different aspects on one single parallel plane. So we're not trying to suggest that hatred as like an emotion is the root of all genocide, but of course it's part of it, right? You will see that manifest in different types of ways, sometimes in propaganda, sometimes in individual accounts, as genocide is unfolding. But you're also going to see all of these other things happening that are part of how you can begin to explain how individuals are interpreting their circumstances and why they're taking these different pathways towards perpetration. And so it tries to really expand your view of all the different types of factors that can affect that. On the pyramid of like the peace model side, a lot of that research comes from peace studies. So John Paul Lederach's sort of levels of reconciliation idea, thinking about how sort of grassroots actors versus sort of elite political actors all have different roles to play within peace building processes, but they all build on each other. We really tried to incorporate some thinking on that as well. Plus, a little bit more related to the genocide studies literature is kind of this transitional justice literature, or the broader kind of post-atrocity literature about how states implement different types of programs in the aftermath of mass violence in order to enhance reconciliation, memory efforts, et cetera, to kind of reset people's expectations on the intergroup level, but also to kind of reformulate state structures to create protection against some of these risk factors that maybe were evident in a prior case of mass atrocities. So I really tried to kind of build in touches of that transitional justice literature as well when we think about the collective side of that model, because that's a really important piece of the conversation as well. So it's definitely something that I plan to be writing more about and want to share, because it's very much trying to synthesize a lot, right? These are two, I mean, we can talk about genocide studies, we can talk about peace studies. They're two different fields that rarely come in conversation with each other, which is a shame because they really should be in conversation with each other. So trying to leverage all that together is really the goal with the entire project. And this is kind of the first step forward. So absolutely email me, be in touch. I'd love to talk to you more and more details on that, and look for more coming soon.
Okay, thank you for that response. I have to say, as your moderator, I've been, and unfortunately, Juillson had to leave, but I've been teaching genocide studies in a silo for about 15 years, and sometimes I get tired. So I found it sort of re-energizing.
What Tachlied is asking is, how does the locally contextualized educator's guide integrate the unique historical and cultural contexts of DRC to effectively address issues of tribalism, regionalism, and ethnic conflict? And I would answer that that is really at the heart of the reason why they wanted to make the guidebook to begin with. They included teachers from several different regions, and the teachers who are using it and training with it are also, it's expanding exponentially. These two workshops that we held virtually in 2021 and 2022 were all across DRC. So there are teachers from all of these different groups that share this common desire to see peace building and the end of conflict, that are coming together to find ways to share this with their colleagues in smaller settings. So perhaps, like Juillson will do a training with 20 teachers in one space, and a colleague in, for example, Butare might do one in their classroom with another group of teachers. And to that end, recognizing that, first of all, that it's teacher to teacher, and that is exactly how we like to approach things. And that very much with the nothing about us without us frame of mind. We also are looking at creating an education summit so that we can bring together a larger group of stakeholders to support all of the people from these different regions, and really have a strategic plan moving forward for how the guide can be effective and how to continue to build on all of the success that Juillson and the DRC team has already created.
Thank you, Kate. Time is up for our session. So again, thank you to the presenters.